Hi, everyone. I'm Paul Flatto, the Director of the Centre for Social Impact, and welcome to the Centre for Social Impact's Research Seminar Series. This is the first for 2025 today, and I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we're on Whadjuk Noongar land here at UWA and pay my respects to the elders and traditional owners of this land. And today we have Professor David Gilchrist of UWA's Centre for Public Value, who will be talking on the subject, making community services sustainable. So today, David will examine the issue of sustainability in community services, something that he's very well known for, why it's important to the Australian community, why we need structural change to achieve it, and what it looks like when it is achieved. So Professor David Gilchrist is a chartered accountant. He's currently a Professor of Accounting and Foundation Director of the Centre for Public Value at UWA. And before academia, David was Assistant Auditor General for Western Australia, where in fact I first met David some years ago. So among many things, David is founder of the Australian non-profit Accounting Standards Research Program. So welcome everyone, and over to you, David.
Thank you very much, Paul. And I too would like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, from whose lands I'm presenting today, but also to recognise all of those First Nations people from around the state or Australia that you're participating in this presentation from. Paul, thanks for that generous invitation to be able to speak today. I have great respect for the Centre for Social Impact and the work it does, and I think there are great opportunities for conflation of the work that both of our centres do in the context of creating better public policy in terms of funding particularly, but in other areas of not-for-profit social services activity as well. My presentation today is exactly as Paul said, looking at the idea of making community services sustainable, what needs to happen, and what some of the gaps are in relation to that particular issue that we need to be aware of, need to advocate against, but also to make a series of recommendations that I hope will gain some traction in the audience and have some opportunity to be able to raise questions and comments in that regard at the end of the session. So my plan is to speak for about half an hour. I'll go through a series of slides to support those comments that I will make, and then I'd love to have some questions and comments until Paul kicks us out of the platform at the end of the session. So thank you again to CSI for the opportunity, and I'll just share my screen to be able to make sure people can see what I'm talking about. Okay, can people see that okay now, Paul? Brilliant, thank you. Okay, so in terms of making community services sustainable, I want to essentially do four things today. I want to make a point up front. I want to set a proposition, and I wouldn't be much of an academic if I didn't set an initial proposition and then support that proposition as I went through my presentation. So I'll do that shortly. I also want to describe what I call the structural gaps in terms of impacting the sustainability of this important sector. I want to describe what's not working in the context of those gaps, and also propose a series of recommendations that I think will support a way forward to ensure sustainability of community services as we move into our next few years. Particularly, I'm basing my comments on a raft of research that we've undertaken here at the Centre, certainly for the last 15 years, looking at the cost of social services, community services, and more broadly human services, how those costs are not being met by government and what the impact on those current costing funding policies are. But also I want to identify just a couple of recent findings in a report that was launched only a week or so ago that was undertaken looking very deeply into 7 case studies of human services provider organisations around Australia. And I want to be able to use that research research, the findings to support what I'm saying, and hopefully that'll resonate for people in terms of what the outcome needs to be for a sustainable human services or social services environment in this country. I did mention, though, that up front I would like to go through some key points and I guess deliver these points as a set of propositions that I think are really fundamental to our understanding of the challenges that are faced by this sector and the kinds of systemic changes that need to be made to be able to meet those challenges. First and foremost, it's my contention that government's funding policies are actually crippling the community services sector and its capacity to be able to respond to needs within the community. These points are really designed to try and elicit some comments and some questions, but essentially they're the central outcome of quite a number of years of research. So to that extent, I think that service providers simply are not covering their costs, the comprehensive cost of service delivery, when they undertake their services. We're also seeing quite clearly in the research that service providers don't have the capacity to invest for policy change, don't have the capacity to train or to renew their organisations as time moves on and expectations in the community or otherwise change as well in terms of not just the number of services needed, but also the complexity of those services becomes more significant and substantial. I also see that taxpayers pay more as a result of governments mistaking cheap for efficient. In other words, I think there's a real issue where taxpayers are paying more money for services being delivered outside of the social services sector because the social services sector is unable to respond. And again, I'll talk to this a little bit more substantially when I get to that point in the presentation. But I do want to say at this point that cheap and efficient are not synonyms. They don't have the same meaning, although they seem to attract the same meaning from a funder perspective. I also want to say then that lack of transparency is also a major issue in this environment in which we're unable to see whether the service mix shrinkage is actually impacting the services delivered to those in need in the community. The service mix is a summary term or a term that we use to describe the need in the community and how the sector responds to that need. And I'll talk to that idea in a little while. But what I would say is that this lack of transparency means that any shrinkage in service mix as a result of poor funding is actually hidden. And that is hidden in the context of funding policy, but also in the context of indexation policy, which is not based on evidence of total cost of services. Ultimately, this means that service users are the shock absorbers of the system. Because we can't see what's going on in terms of the system, because we can't see what the impacts of poor funding policy are in relation to the capacity of that system to deliver services, it's actually the service users that are absorbing the outcomes of those arrangements. And we see underutilisation in areas such as under the NDIS, but we're fairly certain that there's underutilisation across most program areas. And we think that this is being hidden but absorbed by impacting on those less able to be able to absorb those issues in the community. So I guess then, and I'm talking fairly fast because I've only got half an hour and I've got a lot of material to get through. But again, I'm hoping that we've got some questions and comments when we get to that stage in the presentation. The first question, though, and the most important question is, what is sustainability? We consider in the Centre for Public Value that sustainability can be approached in two ways. It can be approached at a macro or system sustainability level. That is, how sustainable or what's the sustainability capacity of the system to continue to deliver services that it needs to deliver. We can also think about sustainability from a micro perspective, that is the organisation survivorship perspective. We don't study organisation survivorship per se, and I guess to put it in a way that might solicit comments and feedback, we don't really care about individual organisations per se. We're interested in the extent to which the system can continue to provide the services that it needs to provide. And so to that extent, I'll talk about the issue of macro or systemic breakdown in service delivery, not about micro organisations or specific organisations not being able to meet need. The other aspect that we talk about sustainability in relation to is, of course, the service mix, which I briefly talked about a few minutes ago. And service mix essentially makes up, or is the description of the quantity, the quality of services that are needing to be delivered and the timing of those services. And clearly, we're not interested in organisations merely surviving if those organisations as a system can't continue to deliver the quantity of services needed at the right quality and at the right timing. That's not sustainability. Even if the organisations are still here at the end of the financial year, we haven't been sustainable in our view. So in meeting that service mix, it's very necessary that funders pay the comprehensive cost of service delivery in a short, medium and long-term sense of sustainability. To be able to ensure that that happens, we actually need three things we consider. The first one is that we need to ensure that we are looking at service mix as the appropriate lens through which we judge sustainability, not organisational survivorship. The other must-haves are that we need to have transparency over what the need is, not what the demand is, and I'll talk to this idea shortly, but we need to know what need is in the community. We also need to have transparency over the services that are provided to meet that need, and the extent to which it's met helps us to have transparency then over the service delivery gap. If we don't understand the service mix gap, then we can't understand the extent to which government spending priorities are appropriate or otherwise. That includes within the sector, but it also includes voters' perspective on this particular issue. Is NDIS too expensive? Or is it expensive enough, or is it not provided enough resources to be able to do what it needs to do? It's very, very difficult to be able to make that judgment when we don't really know what the extent of need is in the community. The other aspect then is the structural gaps that we see in terms of the systemic view and looking at the service mix particularly. So a couple of things that I'll say about that. One is that government's prioritisation and resourcing lacks accountability. Because we've got no transparency over these questions that we've identified, it's very difficult to be able to bring government to account. And that doesn't mean, and I'm sure those people in the room would understand and appreciate, no one wants government to misspend money. But it's also not necessary that government might meet or close that gap. They might have a good reason for not doing that. At the moment, there's no accountability about that particular gap and no explanation about the extent to which the gap should be closed and what government is spending alternative money on. So submarines versus the NDIS is a great example, but there are many other examples in our current litany of political processes that are going on with a Commonwealth Government election coming up shortly. The other element that's well hidden in all of this discussion is the fact that when government chooses cheap over efficiency, it actually ends up spending more money to deliver services. How can that be? It is because that when organisations are paid a fee for services or a price for services that's unsustainable, at the end of the day, they've really got one option in terms of levers they can pull, and that is to reduce the quantity of services that they deliver. If the services of such as human services or community services are reduced, that means that primary healthcare services have to pick up the slack at a much higher rate of cost to state governments. It means that taxpayers pay ultimately at the end of the day, but there's no transparency over that avoidable cost in the primary healthcare system that we really need to think about and we need to have exposed. In other words, yes, social services are expensive, but they're a lot cheaper than healthcare services, primary healthcare services provided in a hospital setting, for instance. But there's also the community cost to that at the end of the day as well, where people aren't able to get hospital beds or get access because those beds are occupied by people that should be supported in other ways in the community. The other element, as I've said before, is this issue of a lack of transparency. So the identification of the service mix gap and the cost of comprehensive cost of service delivery is unknown and unidentifiable because we don't have data assets to be able to make that identification transparent. I've already spoken then about what's not working to some degree, but I guess the two elements that what's not working falls into for me are what is funded and what's the price that's achieved, and then how does indexation work? And I want to talk to indexation. I've already talked to cheap versus efficiency. I think that's a really important consideration, but so too is need versus demand. When we talk about demand in economics terms, we're actually talking about the number of services in a program that are purchased by government, not the number of services that are needed in the community. And we don't reconcile those two things. In other words, government doesn't have to. There's no obligation for government to buy all of the services needed, but we do need transparency over that gap, if you like. The other element that is important, and our research is showing very, very significantly, is that increasing regulatory and quality assurance costs are really making it difficult for organisations to be able to operate financially sustainably. QA and regulatory costs are among the 5 top costs that we've identified as increasing over the last 3 years in our research promoted recently or published recently, along with administration costs that are small in terms of the total turnover, but in real terms, because profit margins are so slight for these organisations, these costs have a really significant effect on the sustainability and ongoing capacity of organisations to operate. The other element that we don't really understand in that costing or funding arrangement is that the funding is not actually based on the comprehensive cost of service delivery. Primarily, it's based on historical appropriations that are adjusted for CPI or some other method of adjustment to bring those programs up to the starting line at the start of the financial year. That leads me to the problems associated with indexation as well, which again, I think many people in the room are going to be well aware of. But essentially, in our research, no case has reported that indexation has actually met cost increases in any jurisdiction or in any location around Australia. To that extent, there are further substantial complexities relating to indexation that make it very difficult for organisations to operate sustainably. One element is that indexation's inconsistent. Organisations report that they're unable to predict what that indexation is going to be and the extent to which their costs are going to be met. It's also unreliable, and there are many organisations around Australia in very different jurisdictions that are reported that their departments that purchase services from them don't necessarily hand on the level of indexation that's actually been declared by the central agencies, say Treasury or Premier and Cabinet or Prime Minister and Cabinet, depending on the jurisdiction. We also have inappropriate indexation models being established, so that the predominant model that is used is a mix between wages price index and CPI, both absolutely inappropriate in terms of the basket of goods and wages services needed to be able to support the delivery of human services. And so we've got some comments on that coming forward, but the final point, of course, was the lack of transparency there. The other element that is important to consider, and I'm sorry I am speaking fast, but I'm trying to make sure I get through everything. What's not working? One of the things that's not working or is not well understood, either in the government area or in the sector, I might add, relates to the issue of profitability. Organisations, any organisation that operates in a market economy like Australia, a mixed economy, needs to be profitable in order to be sustainable. To be financially sustainable, you need to think about that in 3 time terms or periods, if you like. One is to be immediately sustainable in the short term, which means that you have to be solvent. I'm sure it's not news to anyone in the room today that organisations have to pay their bills as and when they fall due. They have to be able to pay their staff and so on. When we think about sustainability, that's often where we actually draw the line in terms of our horizon for assessing financial sustainability of organisations. But there's also mid-term sustainability needing to be considered. This mid-term sustainability in financial terms delivers what we call stability, which means that the organisation's able to pay things like long service leave or leave entitlements or other provisions that might come out of their operations over time. This is a really, really important aspect of financial sustainability because, of course, even if your comprehensive cost of service delivery is funded today, your long service leave or your annual leave is not taken until subsequent pay periods at subsequent pay rates. So it's likely that they'll be more expensive to you when they're actually taken at some point in time. And so when we talk about mid-term sustainability, it means that the organisation needs to be profitable enough to be able to meet its costs as and when they fall due to maintain solvency, but also to be able to pay its employees and pay for other provisions as time drags on. In a long-term sense, financial sustainability relates in the organisation being able to continue to train its staff to be able to re-engineer the way it does things in the context of quality assurance and regulatory requirements, but also changes in practices and community expectations about how services should be delivered. There might also be changes as a result of research identifying technical or other aspects of service delivery that need to be invested in and changed. If organisations don't make a profit, they can't build their balance sheet. If they don't build their balance sheet, then they can't invest in these kinds of changes. And so there becomes a great difficulty in terms of maintaining that financial sustainability in the long term as a result of that outcome. I guess then from that perspective, sector providers can't maintain that sustainability without making a profit. Our contention is that that profit needs to be higher than the CPI in order to be able to at least allow their balance sheets to keep up with economic growth, the growth in the economy that's occurring, as one way to look at it. There are other ways to predict what profit you need, and I'd be happy to talk about those in the question and comment time. But at the end of the day, without making a profit, you can't be sustainable as an organisation in the short, medium and longer term. One example of this profitability issue, though, came out of the recent work that I talked about in my prefatory comments, where we looked at 7 organisations, case study organisations across Australia, and we looked at 3 years of profitability statements and a raft of other things that related to their profitability, amongst other financial sustainability issues. So we had 21 years observations. We had 7 organisations times 3 years each, so 21 years observations altogether. In those observations, we identified that 9 observations were losses. We identified a further 9 observations were less than CPI. And remember, I said that CPI is a bit of a proxy for us in terms of profitability, because a 1%, 2% or break-even type profitability is not acceptable for sustainability. We need to get a profitability level that allows the organisation to build its balance sheet. And we saw 2 organisations, or rather 2 year observations, where a profit was above CPI. So out of 21 year observations, we saw 18 that were actually delivering below sustainability levels of profitability for those organisations. So as I said, CPI as a proxy for economic growth overall is indicating that these organisations are not maintaining their balance sheet capacity. So having spoke about that very quickly and having about 5 minutes left, I want to actually talk about some of the resolution elements of this, or some of the suggestions that we might make to see how we could advocate to resolve this issue. When we think about funding, then, to our mind, there are 3 aspects to funding. The first aspect relates to the tendering process or the initial contracting process, which we think needs to be developed or improved by relying on actual cost of service delivery to support the evaluation of what the price should be from government's perspective. So in other words, there should be data collected to be able to understand what the comprehensive cost of service delivery is, what the profit needs to be in order to set that appropriation appropriately. We also see that the system should allow for 5 yearly contracts so that organisations have confidence to make investment, but also to be able to retain staff who don't feel threatened that their job's not going to be continued in time to come. The other element that's extremely important and not thought about too much is that at the end of the day, there also needs to be capital injections in the case of policy changes, in the case of regulatory or other changes that require systemic change within organisations, that require training for organisations or other investments in things like software or capacities to be able to meet need. For instance, we often talk about the need for organisations to be reporting on their impact or their outcomes and so on, which is absolutely important, and the work of CSI demonstrates this on a daily basis. But at the end of the day, capital injections are required to be able to support that process effectively, knowing that that capital will be repaid with better, more efficient, more effective services being delivered. At the end of the day, without those capital injections, similar to the types of injections that were required when we had COVID, the organisations can't maintain their productive capacity going forward. The final point then relates to indexation and the need for the development of an indexation model that's actually going to represent the change in costs experienced by organisations. Remembering with indexation too that when a government sets indexation and applies it to funding, that indexation actually commences from the new financial year. The idea is to bring the price up to the value that is represented by the comprehensive cost of service delivery as at that first day in the new financial year. It doesn't repay the cost that's been going out as a result of underfunding for the previous year, but importantly, it doesn't foresee increases in costs over the coming year. And so organisational sustainability means that profits need to be generated to be able to fund that gap that is continually faced by organisations, even when indexation is calculated correctly. The other point I'd make here is that we think the Australian Bureau of Statistics should create an index to be able to calculate this issue of indexation so that governments don't have the conflict of interest in relation to that calculation, but also so there's transparency over the level of indexation provided. In other words, if the ABS calculates indexation and governments give you less, they need to be accountable for that. It is their sovereign choice to make that decision. I'm not denying that, but they need to be accountable for that decision. And so to that extent, we think a producer price index should be calculated for this sector to support the creation of a relevant indexation model. Okay, so I've said all I want to say in terms of new material. I now want to go through a set of recommendations that we've developed that we think is really important to be advocating for going forward. One of those recommendations, or the first one here, is that we need a comprehensive contracting process that is demonstrably based on the empirical evidence of cost and service mix requirements for the communities that organisations operate in. We need an indexation process, and it won't be news to you, having said what I've just said, that ensures the timely and full allocation of funding to cover cost increased experience of contract providers at least once per annum. We'd love to see it more frequently, but certainly once per annum is the minimum expectation. In terms of a third recommendation, we think there needs to be a mature impact base to policy changes and social shifts and shocks by injecting levels of capital into the funded sector to ensure the comprehensive cost of service delivery is fully met in a timely and effective manner. Organisations must be able to invest in training, technology, capacity and change in order to be sustainable going forward. That's only appropriate to government in terms of achieving efficiencies and value for money for funding that's provided, and also only fair to those service users who need those supports to be able to live their lives. The final recommendation then relates to a really important issue that we've raised a number of times over the years, and that is that we need a comprehensive data asset development process to ensure this transparency. We need to collect data on need, as well as data on services delivered, as well as data on the comprehensive cost of service delivery. That will add work to organisations, there's no doubt about that, but that should also be added to the comprehensive cost of service delivery as a simple transparency and governance mechanism that's needed to be able to make these things work. So I guess overall then, in terms of the resolution, trust, removal of the one-size-fits-all funding models that we tend to have, having based budgeting on real data so that the government budgets mean something in terms of the comprehensive cost of service delivery, having a producer price index, having local decision making so that resources are allocated in the style that's going to be best for the communities being served, and also having capacity and outcomes transparency is absolutely critical. The other point that I haven't spoken about, but which I think is really important given that I am a few minutes over my time allocation, is that of financial literacy. One of the things that's been constantly thrown up in our research is that organisations don't have sufficient financial literacy to be able to manage these elements, but so too government doesn't have sufficient financial literacy to understand the impacts of policy from a financial sustainability perspective. And so we think there needs to be a significant comprehensive plan of financial literacy building on both sides of the fence, if you like, in order to support that sustainability on the one side, but also to support government's capacity for understanding value for money on the other. The final point then that I just want to recognise is that in November last year, Blueprint Expert Reference Group made up of sector leaders at a national level was commissioned by government to develop what we've called the Not-for-Profit Sector Development Blueprint. And I and a few other academics were involved in this process, as well as I think expert advisors. I suggest that this is something that's well worth reading from the point of view of the sector, because I think it builds some advocacy opportunities for you. But most importantly, I wanted to just confirm that at the end of the day, the first theme out of the three major themes that are dealt with in this blueprint actually relates to the kinds of things we've been talking about. So my final point would be that we've certainly communicated these ideas to government quite effectively over a number of years, and have now got a report and an action blueprint that sets these things out and what needs to be done. I guess my admonition to the sector is now government needs to be accountable to say what they're actually going to do in response to this particular report. Paul, that's all I wanted to say. Really happy to take questions and comments. Thank you.
Well, thanks, David. That was a truly, I mean, you talk about comprehensive cost, but that was a truly comprehensive presentation. And we have made a point to say that you will receive details about where that presentation and set of PowerPoints will go. So open it up to questions now. We have questions in the chat, David, that you can start looking at. And people can present these questions, also present questions directly. So just raise your hand in that online sense, and I'll try and find you. But we can first of all go to Robert Campbell. Now you've got a question there. If you're online,
yes,
you can unmute yourself and actually ask it directly, Robert.
Yes, well, here's a question to David. I put on my auditor hat and I see lots and lots of examples of poor service proposals that win the contract, but then obligate the organisation to unviable subsidy of future losses in relation to the program, simply because of lack of financial literacy, but also out of human greed to acquire services.
Bob, really nice to see you, by the way. We haven't caught up for a while, so it's lovely to see you there. And a really prescient question. So financial literacy is the root cause here, where governments don't really understand the risk that they are facing when they're evaluating some of these tenders, and making pronouncements such as you can only charge 10% to admin, or you can only do this, or you can only do that, causes or inbuilds in these processes these kinds of problems. So I agree with you. I think the other problem is, though, at the sector level, we need to have some honest discussions about pricing, costing and pricing, and particularly about building capacity in that regard, because I also see, to be honest, in advocacy areas, some erroneous references to costing and pricing. For instance, examples where people have shown how you cost and price when the government does set parameters like maximum administrative amounts. So, Bob, I'm absolutely 100% behind that. I think it's one of the most central issues facing sustainability in the sector is our capacity to be able to understand the financial aspects and to be able to cost and price effectively so that we know what's going on.
Right.
Yes.
Thanks for that. Good. Now, the next question I have from Chris. Chris Toomey. You there, Chris?
Yes, I am. Thank you, Paul. Hi, David.
Hi, Chris.
Fantastic presentation as always. I wanted to kind of follow on from your talk at the end where you were talking about what we need to do in terms of creating some sort of shared data asset that allows us to get both a really good measure of what the real costs are, but also how that then relates to meaningful and practical outcomes and impact that goes across different services and programs and disciplines. So I'm interested in what does that look like practically, and to what extent is this something that we're expecting that all individual community organisations build the capacity to do, or to what extent do we have some sort of shared or independent body institution that they can call on to do that? You know, for instance, like the kind of UK data labs model or something.
Really good question, Chris, and I think a really important one. I'll answer it in a bit of a roundabout way, in the sense that we really don't invest in this sector. One of the things that undertaking the blueprint, developing the blueprint, really taught us was that there's just such under-investment in the sector at a sector level, led by government or otherwise, to be able to build capacity around data, to build capacity around change in a theory of changes, if you like, in terms of how services are delivered and the complexity of those services. So at the very top level, we need to invest. I think we need to invest in central capacity to be able to lead change processes, to build databases and to build analytical capacity in relation to those databases. So data is not information, as I know you know very well, and the skills needed to both collect appropriate data and then to analyse data are very significant and can take time to build. So I think, number one, we should take the 10-year blueprint horizon and have a 10-year plan to try and build this kind of data collection, analytical and reporting capacity. I think, number two, that we need, and the reason I put trust in that second last slide was because at the end of the day, we need to have increased trust and cooperation and what I would call real collaboration between government and the sector to be able to devise an understanding of what is needed, devise an understanding of what the priorities are, because there's never enough money. And, we can't just sit here and expect government to simply sign checks to get more money out there when we don't really understand the governance processes around that. And I think thirdly, to ensure that we have the development investment needed. So as one of those central pillars of funding, having the capital injections in order to give these organisations the capacity to be able to learn, invest and understand what needs to be collected, but in conjunction with government. I think one organisation that might be able to do that well, and I'm perhaps extending it a little bit far, I might get into trouble in some sense, but I think the ABS would be a fantastic organisation to work forward on this with the sector and with governments, because they are arm's length. There's no doubt as to their statistical and data capacity. There's no doubt as to their technical capacity, and they don't have a dog in the race, so to speak. They're not interested in the outcome per se, other than that it's an appropriate outcome. So So I see that as one entity, but I'm sure there are other entities that could be developed to do it. I think one of the things that market economics, continual reference to market economics has done is really damaged our capacity to work collaboratively between government and the sector, and also in some ways within the sector as well. And I think that's a really important aspect too. So I'd love to see much more true collaboration and a 10-year plan to look at how we can actually improve our governance transparency over these issues.
Good. Thanks for that. Thanks, Chris. Now, I don't know whether this was a question, Chelsea, but you did ask to see the last slide again. So Chelsea's asked to see the last slide. If Chelsea wants to ask a question related to that last slide, she can. Chelsea, you're there. I can see that you're there. Did you want to ask a question, or are you just interested in seeing this? Not that one, but the one before. Yes. No. Is it that one?
Thanks, Paul, but I just missed it. So I just had wanted to see the red text caught my eye, but I missed it. So
okay.
But yeah, thank you. I think, I guess my reflection working in a sector of very small, generally very small not-for-profits, community legal services, there is a lot in here in terms of development of financial capacity. We're just starting to learn about costing and pricing as a sector. We've been operating under an informal direction from government about not spending more than 20% on back-end costs, but at the same time investing in partnership capacity and all these things that actually require robust leadership, good data infrastructure, all those things. Often it costs more than 20%, and we need to be doing that work, I think, as a sector. Love the idea of more central assistance to do that work, because it is challenging for small organisations to learn that, even with the support of people like yourselves and Department of Finance and Peaks and so on. There's a lot of learning here I can see for our sector. That's important.
Yeah.
And it's naive too, I think, for funders, not just governments, but other funders as well, to set parameters around administration and so on. It's an ambit claim that's designed to try and contain prices when two things fundamentally happen. One, sustainability issues impact, so that when you're not able to deliver those services, government basically has to accept that outcome, but also there's a transfer of costs either within the jurisdiction to other departments or interjurisdictionally between departments of different governments. And these things aren't transparent, but they end up costing more. Ultimately, it all costs more if we don't invest, and if government doesn't understand what kind of costs it should be incurring to be able to get value for money out of these investments.
But at the same time, you feel like you have to deliver this incredible value on the smell of an oily rag, because otherwise you can't demonstrate how valuable and important you are and how much more money you need. It's a bind. It
is a bind, but it's I put it this way, and I put it this way in all good faith. At the end of the day, it's a demonstration of value in artificiality. So you're trying to wordsmith or numbersmith an outcome that actually isn't reflective of the real cost of service delivery, and therefore you're building in unsustainability into your model. And at some point that has to change. My gut feeling is, having done this for a long time, that service delivery gap is expanding quite rapidly at the moment. And we see that our best proxy for that is probably NDIS, because we've seen over the years of the NDIS a delivery or underutilisation, it's called in that framework, of between 20 and 30% over the last decade or however long it's been operating. The first few years we can accept that because, of course, it was an establishing program, but we're a long way down the track now and we're still seeing that underutilisation. That worries me from a number of perspectives, to be honest. One is that we don't talk about that within the sector as being identifying the issue that there's not sufficient resources or a sufficient long-term view of sustainability to support those services. So if, for instance, underutilisation is travelling at 10% under the NDIS, it means 10% of the $40-odd billion $4 billion is figuratively in people's back pockets, and they're unable to get the services that they've already been identified as needing to be able to live their life. I would say on simply a gut feeling that those kinds of gaps extrapolate into other programs that we have no knowledge of. And so why do we say that those service recipients are the shock absorbers? Because they're the ones that actually are absorbing the change in outputs from organisations and the changes in costs. But we just don't have any way of metricising that. And I think that's a really significant governance issue in a democracy that's allocating very significant funds to these processes in the expectation that the outcome's going to be achieved in the interests of those people that need services.
Good. Thanks, David. And the questions are coming and statements are coming pretty thick and fast at the moment. I think, Sally, you've got a question up there, and Michael's got a comment or maybe a question as well. But yeah, let's go to Sally first.
Hi, yes, my question was just, I hear what you're saying about financial literacy, but what's your advice for organisations who are about to go into contract negotiations? And yeah, they do that, you know, they probably don't have that level that you're talking about in terms of financial literacy or access to it. So what's your best advice in that respect?
It's a very difficult one, and I'll be very happy to chat offline as well in relation to this issue. I guess all I can say for a audience is have a general response. One element is knowing yourself. So actually, I think know thyself is the critical aspect of this, and knowing or identifying already that you've got financial literacy challenges in your organisation is an important first step, if you like. I think the second step then is looking at the extent to which this is a short-term significant problem from a solvency perspective is where I would start. I would then start to look at the extent to which my organisation is able to cover costs like employee entitlement. So in other words, I'm probably suggesting that you come from a risk perspective rather than from a comprehensive cost of service delivery perspective if you've got those challenges. Then the long-term plan, or rather the longer-term plan, is to see how you might be able to recruit to achieve resourcing to support your enhancement of your financial literacy. That might include, for instance, I've seen work in a number of organisations where they have finance committees, but they recruit non-board members to those committees, but people that have very significant appropriate skills, such as finance skills. Often that's actually more attractive for finance people because they don't need to be across the whole board operations or the whole operations of the organisation, and relatively speaking, they can contribute to your organisation without investing more than they might otherwise have to invest as directors. So there's a number of ways to do it. I'm happy to chat offline as well, but I do think initially taking a risk view and understanding what would happen if you needed to, for instance, to pay out your employee entitlements is a really important first step to understanding that gap. The second element is understanding what it truly costs you to deliver services. And so that's the costing process, and looking at that in the context of the gap that's created between what the funder pays and what it actually costs you in the short, medium and longer term. But that's, again, a financial literacy issue.
Good. Now, Michael's got a comment about Robert's question and comment. Michael, are you there? Because it'd be worthwhile, and I know Robert's there because Robert's waiting to make a comment and further question. But Michael, are you online?
I'm here. Thanks, Paul. It was more by way of a comment, an observation to Robert's point earlier, and that is for many of us, we never or rarely get the chance to price our services anyway. So, you know, to suggest that there's a deficiency in our pricing is probably a little bit unfair. For a number of the participants in this audience, I'd imagine. So we're left, as I say, in this position where the choice is, and it's a valid choice, it's a real choice, is whether you tender or not. you know, and that still requires the financial literacy that David, you spoke to. We've got to understand what the real costs are and make an assessment. But unfortunately, it becomes more complex than that, because there's a pressure on us to participate, to dive in anyway, particularly where there's concerns about the level of quality of the service that might be delivered. You know, and I don't know who's in this conference at the moment. I mean no disrespect, but we see a lot of new entrants coming in, people that perhaps don't have that level of understanding or professionalism, dare I say it, or perhaps have a profit motive. We're seeing commercial operators coming in, and so there's mounting pressure on NGOs to dive in and participate in any event and try and make the best of it. So there's some policy issues we need to bear in mind as well.
Absolutely, and they're the policy issues I guess I'm aiming to target, but your comments resonate deeply with me, Michael. At the end of the day, even if government comes and says, we will give you $10 for each widget you deliver, and we're not going to negotiate, you still need to cost and price, because you need to know the gap between the two. And I guess one of the things that strikes me, and again, everything that you've said absolutely resonates, but often organisations, in my experience, when I get to look at them closely, are adopting or accepting under funded price from government with no real knowledge of the financial jeopardy that they're entering into. So that's the key issue from my perspective. At the end of the day, you might choose to deliver a service that is underfunded and fund it some other way, cover the gap some other way because it's important for your mission, or it might even be politically important because, as you say, you come under a lot of pressure. But for instance, in some work that we did recently, I won't say which jurisdiction because I'm under media interdict not to, but we've just finished the report. That organisation, that jurisdiction, the Human Services Organisation, paid about 3% to deliver extra services that were funded by government. In other words, government, say, gave them an extra $100,000 to deliver services. It cost them $103,000 to deliver those services. So, you know, and this happens all the time where you're put under pressure, particularly in May. We're heading towards that time now. Government suddenly finds it's got some money to deliver services and it puts you under pressure to buy services. So look, again, it reconciles with everything that we know. I think the central premise is know thyself, so that you understand and intellectually adopt that financial risk rather than just simply accidentally adopting it, not really understanding what the outcome is. But thank you, Michael.
Good. Just to let you know that Carol's just put a link to the paper, the report that you mentioned right at the beginning, David.
Thank you.
Real costs, real impact, path to social services sustainability. And that is a report that's out in the public arena, but that you have released.
Yes.
So that's a very good read, along with what you've got right on the screen right now, the not-for-profit sector development blueprint. So the blueprint is a very useful document as well.
Yeah.
I know, Michael, you did have your hand up earlier, but is there a further question? Yeah. No further question. Now we've got a number of comments. I've also let people know that you can go to the CSI website. I put the website up there to see all the past seminars, and of course this seminar will be up there as well. In terms of the PowerPoints and the recording, and David's centre will also have it up there as well. Are there any further questions or comments? I actually do have a couple of David.
Of course.
Yeah, just very quickly. The question of comprehensive costs. Now, this is going beyond comprehensive costs, but we do a lot of analysis on cost offsets.
Yes.
And whilst it's not a direct costing concept per se, you know, the offset that the not-for-profit sector provides when it achieves certain outcomes. For example, it does homelessness services, and that reduces hospital costs, for example.
Yes.
To me, seems like a really important concept. Lies a little bit beyond the the straight accounting area, but the more we can present dollars like that, the more we understand the effectiveness of services.
I couldn't agree more. I think this is the big problem to me, is there's two administrative conveniences that government perpetrates that I think is really important to recognise. The first one is jurisdictional convenience. That is, that it's some other jurisdiction. Commonwealth doesn't care if WA pays more, couldn't care less. WA couldn't care less if Commonwealth pays more. The trouble is, it's the same group of taxpayers that are paying both lots of money. So I think that's a convenience. I think the other administrative conveniences within government between departments and allocating resources accordingly. We've been working hard, for instance, to try and get information from the health department about the beds that are taken up that shouldn't be taken up because of the lack of services available elsewhere. We think that this is an absolutely critical area, because we think that community services are expensive. I'm not pretending that it's not, but we also know that the community expects these services to be provided. And we also know, on top of that, that the administrative conveniences allow government to be ill-disciplined and allow government to be inefficient in terms of the use of taxpayers' funds. And I think there should be clarity over that. There should be transparency over that.
Yeah, fantastic. So we're coming to the end. We've had a great session, 60 odd people online. And as just a final reminder, you can go to our two websites, and you will find at some point very soon the details about the presentation, where you'll get the PowerPoints, etc. I think we can email you out those links as well. But Carol's just added a couple more links. You can subscribe to our Centre for Social Impact newsletter, where you will find details of these presentations. Next webinar is actually on impact investment with Phoebe McClements. And then we'll be doing one on cost-benefit analysis. So keep in touch. They're going to be every month. This was a very good start. We thank you, David. And you can see so many different comments thanking you